The black families of Waverly lived through difficult and dramatic times. No family captures that drama and exemplifies that historical sweep better than the Keyes family. The patriarch George Keyes started it all. He was the founding father of Waverly's Colored Hill settlement back in the mid-1840s. But before escaping north and landing in Waverly, he had endured degradation as a young man born into slavery down in Maryland. According to what George's son said years later, the Maryland slave master had quote-unquote mated George to a young slave woman so they could breed more slaves for him. But the master fell on hard times and suddenly sold away the young woman and their 2 infants. George had no idea where his slave family was sent, and he would never see them again. George was able to slip north on the Underground Railroad into Pennsylvania. Once he reached the Abington area, a white farmer hid him from a posse of slave hunters. White sympathizers took George to nearby Waverly for safekeeping, and he grew reassured enough by its conditions to decide to stay and begin an unlikely new life there. Soon other fugitive slaves passing through saw that Waverly was a relatively safe place and, following George Keyes' lead, decided to stay. Within 5 years, George had married a free black woman from Wilkes-Barre and brought her to the emerging black settlement on the edge of Waverly that was being called Colored Hill. There they started a new family together. George was one of the first blacks to build a house on a rented plot there. George's allies in the village's white Methodist church helped him start Colored Hill's black church. The other white Waverly churches also joined to provide schooling and extra help. These were hopeful times. Like the other fugitive men, George became a farmhand on one of the area's farms. His wife Hannah probably became a domestic for a white family, and their 2 sons were enrolled in the village's primary school. But then came the Federal Fugitive Slave Act of 1850, which greatly increased the danger for runaways like him. George joined an armed patrol that was prepared to stand up to any slave hunters who came near. According to George's son, the fugitive farmhands did wield their pistols and pitchforks to drive off slave hunters on at least one occasion. 1861 to 65 brought the gripping events of the American Civil War. George and his family watched as the region's whites divided into one camp that supported the war against the Southern secession, and another camp that angrily blamed President Lincoln, abolitionists, and black people for the troubles. That camp also bitterly fought the very notion of having black Union soldiers. But once blacks were allowed to enlist in 1863, George and his elder son, George Jr., volunteered and were mustered into the mighty 22nd U.S. Colored Troops. The website segment titled Charging into History tells about their exploits on the battlefields of Virginia. Keyes' father and son took part in the famous events at Petersburg on June 15, 1864. Fortunately, they escaped injury that day, but soon afterwards a bullet found George Sr. On July 4th, he was out seeking water for his men when a Confederate sharpshooter shot him in the thigh. George Jr. was not with him. Being a bugler, he would have been kept behind the front lines. But George Sr.'s buddy out on the water patrol that day, another soldier from Waverly named Francis Asbury Johnson, also was shot. They were pulled to safety and were soon shipped away to a large army hospital to its second-rate segregated ward. Their wounds were serious and infection set in. After a few months in the hospital, young Asbury Johnson asked to be sent home, where raging infection soon killed him at age 16. Quote, "He bade us all goodbye, laid his head in his mother's arms, and stepped into the chariot which bore him to the skies," wrote Asbury's father, who had been Colored Hill's preacher. George Keyes Sr., meanwhile, would languish in his segregated hospital ward down in Virginia until the war ended. At that point, he was shipped home to Waverly, still in bad shape, bedridden in the care of his wife and younger son, Ed. The leg wound worsened, oozing pus and even bone fragments, his doctor said, until George Keyes died in his bed in February 1867. He was 45. He and Francis Asbury Johnson were two of the 38,000 black men in uniform to die of Civil War battle injuries. In fact, 10 of the 13 men from Waverly returned home from the war with some form of injury or disability, an astonishingly high rate. By the time George died in 1867, he was receiving a mere $4 a month military pension, 1/5 the income of an average black family. After he died, his wife struggled to get any widow's pension. They had run into a pension system that tended to balk at ex-slaves who were illiterate, had no vital records, and had changed their names. Historians say pension examiners would overlook defects in white cases, but didn't give black applicants the same benefit of the doubt. The inferior treatment of his family may have been one of the things that aroused George's son, Ed. Let's look at Ed's life. As a young man, he became a barber in Waverly, but he also turned into a political activist. Post-war federal amendments had granted blacks the vote and other civil rights, but by the mid-1870s, black activists had seen efforts to clarify and strengthen those rights become stalled by legislative inaction, even by their allies in the Republican Party. In 1874, Ed Keyes, then only 25, delivered a speech at the State Equal Rights League's annual convention, declaring, quote, "We have been deserted by our friends or pretended friends. The freedom of the colored people is only a nominal thing. We insist upon the Republican Party, upon our friends in both parties, giving us free and impartial rights. We ask for an equal footing, that is all." While blacks fought against widespread social and legal discrimination, back in Waverly, conditions weren't so bad. For his part, Ed continued to cut the hair of white and black customers. In 1898, residents even selected him to be Waverly's High Constable. It had taken Waverly more than a quarter century since blacks were granted citizenship to cross the color line and name a black person to a town office, but it did, and it was a rare thing. Ed's older brother, George Keyes Jr., the bugler and Civil War vet, had his own post-war adventures. He ended up moving to Scranton to seek his fortune along with others from Colored Hill. There, George took a prized job as a valet and coach driver for a wealthy white fellow. He also was active in Scranton's black Republican circles and in the city's integrated war veterans post. But George's status as a man about town may have been his own undoing. It seems his white boss was under doctor's orders to stop smoking so many cigars, so the boss simply ordered his quote-unquote loyal Negro, George Keyes, to smoke for him, as many as 15 cigars a day. As they strolled and rolled around town, Keyes would exhale the cigar smoke into his boss's mouth, amusing passers-by to no end. After years of this, though, George developed a lung ailment that killed him. He died on July 4th, 1908, 44 years to the day after his father was shot on the battlefield. Father died a painful death in service to liberty. Son died a painful death serving a white man's guilty pleasure. The Keyes' family history thus traces an uneven journey from abject bondage to valor, from illiteracy to schooling, from an utter lack of civil rights and security to an early round of gains, however hard-won and embattled. They found a measure of fellowship in places like Waverly, but also felt the heavy hand of social bias and entrenched white privilege both south and north.